The physician calls it a cure. You're sitting in a chair in Paris, 1530, and the man across from you has studied Galen, memorized Avicenna, and charged more for this appointment than your family earns in a month. He measures out the mercury. It catches the candlelight the way nothing else does, this liquid silver thing pooling in his palm like a living metal, and he is completely calm about it. He rubs it into your skin. He tells you this is how the syphilis leaves the body. And you believe him, not because you're stupid, but because everyone who matters believes the same thing. That's the opening problem. Not that the poison was hidden. It wasn't hidden at all. It was prescribed, measured, applied by learned hands in good faith, written into medical texts that circulated across Europe for 200 years. The question isn't why people were poisoned. The question is why the poisoning looked exactly like medicine. And to answer that, you have to understand what heavy metals actually do when they enter a body, because they do something. That's the part that made them so convincing and so catastrophically hard to abandon. Mercury is not inert. You apply it to skin, and within hours, the body does something dramatic and legible. It purges, it sweats, it produces saliva in quantities that shocked even the physicians administering the treatment. A patient undergoing mercury fumigation for syphilis in the 16th century might produce 2 or 3 pints of saliva in a single day, their mouth filling and spilling faster than they could spit. The gums swelled, the teeth loosened, the breath turned to something that could clear a room, and the physicians of the time, trained in a framework that understood illness as an imbalance of humors, watched all of this and saw confirmation. The body was expelling the corruption. The reaction was the cure. The more violent the response, the deeper the medicine was working. This is the logic of elegant poison. The poison does something visible. The something visible maps perfectly onto the existing theory of how healing works. So the poison becomes proof of the theory, and the theory becomes the reason to keep using the poison. Ulrich von Hutten wrote about his own mercury treatments for syphilis in 1519 with a candor that makes difficult reading. He survived 11 full courses of the treatment over 9 years. 11. Each one involving rubbing, fumigation, sweating in sealed rooms while mercury vapors moved through the air he breathed. He documented the salivation, the mouth sores, the periods of near total physical collapse. He also believed until late in his life that the treatments were extending it. He died at 35. Whether syphilis or mercury finished him, or both together, nobody can say with certainty. But the body that faced his death had been processing mercury for nearly a decade. The mouth damage alone should have been a signal. Patients who underwent prolonged mercury treatment developed a condition so consistent it had a name: mercurial stomatitis. The gums receded, teeth fell out in clusters, ulcers opened along the inner cheeks and would not close. And here is the cruel geometry of it. Syphilis in its later stages also attacks the mouth. It also causes sores, lesions, the slow dissolution of tissue. So the physician looking at a patient's deteriorating gums faced a genuine interpretive problem. Was this the disease advancing or the medicine working? The symptoms overlapped so precisely that even careful observers struggled to separate them. And in that gap of uncertainty, the mercury stayed. Lead had its own logic. White lead, the compound ground from lead carbonate and dried into powder, was the foundation of fashionable European cosmetics from ancient Rome through the 18th century. Cerussa, they called it. It whitened the skin to a luminous pallor that the period read as health, refinement, distance from outdoor labor. You applied it to your face every morning. If you were wealthy enough, you reapplied it through the day. Queen Elizabeth I is the name that surfaces most often in this conversation, and with reason. The portraits show a face coated white to the hairline. The lead base thick enough that later painters essentially recorded the cosmetic rather than the skin beneath it. Contemporary accounts describe the condition of her skin in her later years in terms that match chronic lead exposure precisely: pitting, discoloration, a texture that required more and more lead to conceal. The treatment was consuming the thing it was meant to display, but lead didn't only sit on the surface. Physicians prescribed lead acetate, sugar of lead, as a sweetener for wine and as a treatment for intestinal complaints. It dissolved easily, it tasted pleasant, and it accumulated in bone, in tissue, in the nervous system over years of use, producing symptoms: fatigue, cognitive fog, irritability, pain in the extremities that were easily attributed to the original illness, or simply to the general difficulty of being alive in the 16th century. Some observers did notice. Paracelsus, writing in the early 1500s, argued that the dose made the poison, which was a more sophisticated position than his contemporaries were prepared to accept. A few physicians noted that patients on long mercury courses seemed to worsen in specific ways that didn't match the disease. But the alternatives were worse in the visible short term. Syphilis without treatment was a documented horror. Lead-free skin was unfashionable. And the immediate effects of mercury, all that dramatic purging, all that productive-looking salivation, were so persuasive in the moment that the slow accumulation happening underneath them was easy to set aside. The body kept the score, though it always does. It just takes longer than the appointment. Arsenic doesn't announce itself. That's the first thing you need to understand about it. Mercury makes a scene. The mouth fills, the gums swell, the room clears. Arsenic works quieter. You take it in the morning. By afternoon, you feel slightly more awake, slightly more hungry than you did the week before. Your skin takes on a kind of glow that the people around you notice before you do. And the physician who prescribed it watches all of this and writes down one word: improving. This is what made arsenic so durable as medicine. Not that it fooled nobody. It fooled the body first. Small doses of arsenic trioxide produce real, legible changes in human physiology. The appetite sharpens. There is a brief stimulant effect that some patients described as vitality returning after long illness. In regions of the Austrian Alps where arsenic eating was documented into the 19th century, local men consumed doses that would have killed an outsider, building tolerance gradually and pointing to their own broad shoulders and clear complexions as evidence that the substance was feeding them rather than dismantling them. And the complexion piece was real in a narrow sense. Arsenic interferes with melanin production. It can temporarily lighten skin and smooth certain surface irregularities. So you take it, your skin looks better, you eat more, you feel briefly like the illness is losing. What you cannot feel is what arsenic is doing to the tissue underneath. The peripheral nerves, the lining of the stomach, the slow accumulation in the hair and fingernails and bone that a forensic chemist 2 centuries later will read like a calendar, month by month, dose by dose, all the way to the end. Antimony wore a different disguise. Where arsenic was quiet, antimony was theatrical, and the theater is what gave it authority. The most persistent story attached to antimony is the everlasting pill, a small tablet of metallic antimony that you swallowed, waited, recovered from your bowel, washed, and passed to the next patient. The laxative effect was real. Metallic antimony does irritate the intestinal lining enough to produce a purgative response, which in humoral medicine was exactly what the physician wanted to see. The body opening, expelling, clearing the corrupted matter that caused disease. The pill was durable enough to use again because metallic antimony doesn't dissolve readily in the gut. Whether individual pills genuinely passed through whole families for generations, as the legend suggests, is difficult to document precisely. What is documented is that antimony preparations were widely prescribed across Europe from the 16th century onward, that they were violently effective as purgatives, and that their violence was consistently read as power. When the body empties itself that thoroughly, something must be happening. That was the logic. The more complete the purge, the deeper the medicine reached. The suffering was not a side effect. It was the point. It was the evidence. Here is the grimmest version of that logic. By the late 17th century, antimony and arsenic compounds had entered regular use as treatments for fevers, skin diseases, and conditions broadly categorized as impurity of the blood. Patients on extended antimony courses sometimes developed a pattern of symptoms that should have been a clear signal to any observer watching closely. The appetite the treatment had initially sharpened began to fail. There was hair loss, and not the kind the original disease produced, weakness in the limbs that progressed in a direction, numbness moving from the hands inward. The face, which had briefly looked better in the early weeks, took on a grayish cast that the physician might attribute to the severity of the underlying condition. And so the dose was held steady, or in some cases increased, because the patient was clearly still fighting something serious and the medicine needed to match it. The deterioration was absorbed into the explanation for why the treatment was still necessary. This was not stupidity. That matters enough to say plainly. The physician at the bedside in 1680 was working from a framework that Nicholas Culpeper had codified in English in 1653, that Galen had constructed across Rome, that Avicenna had refined and transmitted, and that a dozen generations of careful, educated, observant people had refined further. Humoral theory was not a guess. It was a system built from real observations about real bodies, one that tracked patterns, explained correlations, and made predictions that sometimes held. The problem was not that the system saw nothing. The problem was that it saw purging and called it healing, saw stimulation and called it cure, and had no mechanism for detecting accumulation happening below the threshold of the visible. Dose was understood as a variable. Cumulative dose across months and years was not yet a concept the framework had room for. When Culpeper wrote about the proper administration of antimony, he was documenting the best available thinking of his time, transmitted through the best available channels, applied by people who genuinely believed they were pulling patients back from the edge. Some of them were. Certain antimony preparations did clear intestinal parasites. Arsenic in controlled doses was used in the 20th century against specific cancers and still is in forms precise enough to target individual cell processes. The line between cure and poison was always a question of dose and knowledge, and they had one without enough of the other. So here is where it lands. You trust your physician today with the same instinct your ancestor trusted his in 1530. You extend the same faith to the consensus, the credential, the institutional weight of what is considered known. That faith is not naivety. It is a reasonable response to expertise. The same response that has always been a reasonable response to expertise. The difference is the quality of the tools doing the measuring, the mechanisms for catching what the framework misses. History is not a parade of fools swallowing poison. It is a long argument between what the body shows and what the mind can explain, fought by people who wanted the same thing you want, to make the suffering stop. They worked with what they had. So do you.